Good morning. Happy Easter. We're glad you're here. Um, I'm going to start this morning with some announcements. I threatened to wear my muumuu. My mother called this a house dress. I've also been told it's called a duster. And I threatened to wear it on Easter Sunday, and here I am. And Linda Warren said it would not be Easter without an Easter bonnet. So I said, well, that's too bad because I don't wear hats. And then I thought, oh, but I do crochet. So here's my Easter bonnet. I started to put my little pom-pom bunny rabbit on it, but I thought that was probably a bridge too far even for me. So, happy Easter. Here are the announcements before we get started. Stay tuned. We will have worship at 11 o'clock and also the Altogether service at 4 p.m. today. I will put links on our Facebook page so you can find the links to those. But we'll be live streaming a 30-minute worship service at 11 and also at 4. Also, if you look down on our Facebook page, you will see some links to the 7 Last Words videos that the staff did for us for Good Friday. If you didn't have a chance to check those out on Good Friday, that's okay. They're still there, and I highly recommend them. They're probably about 8 minutes each. So just some good words. Another thing in the way of announcements, Karen Harwell will be starting a women's Bible study, Faith Greater Than Fear. It will be done via a Zoom telephone call on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. Eastern Time starting April 14th, running through May 26th. So if you're interested in participating in that, you need to send an email to either Karen or Heather Webb. They can then give you the information for the Zoom call that you will need, the number that you'll need to call, and the passcode that you'll put in to participate in that on Tuesday evenings. Karen Harwell's email is kharwell, HARWELL, at spdl.org. And finally, prayer requests. I have just a few to mention this morning. Our church family needs to be in prayer for the family of Joe Marler. She was an older lady in our congregation, and she passed away on April the 2nd. And also, we have a great big praise this morning. Lisa Job is starting to get some of her peripheral vision back in her eye after her stroke, and that is great, great news. So those are our prayer requests. If you have more prayer requests, please put them in the comments of this video. We'll compile a separate post with all of the prayer requests for this week there, and we would love the opportunity to be able to pray for you as well. So, without further ado, here's Rob with the lesson.
Thank you, Gail. Now, everybody has to get over that visual of the muumuu that you've just given them. We have a saying around our house, nobody wants to see that. But anyway, I'm sure you actually probably enjoyed the old-time Easter outfit. I can remember a time when women wore hats to Easter church and to a lot of other church services too. And there's an old family story that my grandmother, right out in front of Second Ponce de in that little area out in front of the church, she had on her brand new Easter outfit and her Easter hat, and the bird just saw it and targeted that Easter hat. And so, maybe that's why I didn't see her go to church much after that, unfortunately. There's been a tradition in the early church, I'm talking about the first couple centuries or so, of Christianity, in which on this day, the worship leader would say, "He is risen."
And he is risen indeed.
There you go. So I hope I'm going to say that again and give you a chance to say it right out loud. He is risen.
He is risen indeed.
This is the day in which it's a shame, but we really need to stop and make ourselves realize just what we're celebrating. I think it was the year 1999. I was attending a conference in Orlando, Florida. I'd never been to Orlando. I've still never been to Disney World or any of the other various and sundry amusement parks that are down there. But I was attending a publishers conference and got off the airplane in the Orlando airport And of course, it being the home of Disney World, there were these giant statues, full color statues throughout the airport of Disney characters, Mickey Mouse, and um, from various, some of the more recent ones, and they were just gigantic. And when I saw them, the first thing I thought was, I wish our two kids were here to see those those statues, because if I'd seen them when I was a child, as much as I loved Disney characters and cartoon characters in general, I would have instantly made a snapshot in my imagination that never would have faded. It would have been there forever, because things like that would have just impressed me. There would have been an incredible sense of wonder to it. But after thinking about that for a couple seconds as I looked at the giant cartoon characters, I thought, my kids will look at it for about 2 seconds and say, can we get something to eat or whatever? And it's no reflection on my kids. It's just that it's harder to impress a child today because they live in such an age of wonder.
Mm.
And it seems like there's a paradox to it in that we live in an age of wonder, and yet we feel less wonder than we ever have. I can remember in 1969, on July 20th, when we walked on the moon. And that was an incredible moment. We'd done that within 10 years. And, the moment faded, and it wasn't that impressive after that. And it seems to me as if we're not as easily impressed these days. We're just, nothing really captures the imagination. And it might be because there are so many items of tremendous imagination in our world. We have Mars rovers. We have tiny little boxes that are telephones that are also computers that link us to everything in every photo we have, every song we own, the entire internet. There's no way anything like that could have been predicted back in the 1920s and 30s when it was very fashionable to predict the future, and here's what life will be like. And they were always predicting things like flying cars. Dick Tracy had the telephone on his wrist, which we now have, with a screen on it. He could see the person he was talking to, but it's nothing as good as the phones we have. They've vastly outstripped that. So we live in an age of wonder in which we don't experience much wonder, and as we come to this day of all days each year, and it's Easter, we are challenged to feel wonder anew when it's our hearts just take everything for granted. So what we're challenged to do by this lesson is to enter the empty tomb of Jesus with the women who came to the tomb and experience the incredible mingling of fear and wonder and joy and amazement that they felt that turned their lives upside down. As the gospel writers, the four of them, wrote these stories, they understood how hard this was to believe. They knew that. And they were constantly saying things in their gospels such as, this is written that you might believe. And they were careful at all times to name eyewitnesses. When there's a miracle of Jesus, they'll say, so and so saw it. In our lesson, actually, I believe in Mark, the very first account of the resurrection that we have in the Gospels, the word saw appears at every stage. And it's always the women, by the way. We'll get to this. But the women saw the crucifixion. The women saw the deposition, which is the taking Jesus off the cross. And they saw the burial, and then they saw the empty tomb. And so that's given to us that we might see what they saw. They're eyewitnesses, they're observers. It changed their lives, and they want it to change our lives. So what I challenge you to do is let yourself get into this message so this message can get into you today. We're going to study Mark's gospel account, but we're going to do something a little bit, I think, interesting. We're going to compare it to the other gospel accounts. And that's very often not done. And I'll tell you why. The gospel writers, all four of them, they give an account of the passion and the trial and the burial of Jesus, and they're just almost in lockstep. Everything is consistent. All their stories are straight. And then they get to the resurrection and it's all over the place. It's all over the place. Every story of the resurrection is different. In Mark, there's basically no resurrection story at all. It's strongly implied in this first of all Gospels. It's basically, we're told all the way through the Gospel that it's going to happen, that it has happened. It's just that Mark doesn't see fit to tell us what it was like. As a matter of fact, the resurrection is not depicted in any of the Gospels. This is an important point. We are challenged to rely on eyewitnesses. We are told, you must see what the women saw, and you must do what the angels told the women to do, and you must accept on faith that this happened. But we're telling you, the women saw this. The disciples saw this. They experienced it. But the Gospels never show Jesus emerging from the tomb. It just doesn't happen in any of the Gospels. And in a few minutes, we're going to compare this, the four Gospels we have, to a bogus Gospel written probably 70, 80 years later called the Gospel of Peter, which is what gives you an example of what happens when someone tries to make up a story that they don't really have any true experience or knowledge of. So we'll see that in a minute. But let's start off by reading Matthew 28, 1 through 10. If you've got it in front of you, and I hope you do, you will always get more out of something if you're hearing it and seeing it than if you're just hearing it. So I hope you'll take a second to turn to this passage and to listen to it. This is Matthew Gospel, verses 28, chapter 28, verses 1 through 10. Is it 10? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you'll recall Matthew and Luke were written about the same time. Mark was the first gospel written. Matthew follows some of what Mark wrote and adds some other details. Now, after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Now, this is actually, the Marys become very, very confusing, because you find that when you get to the resurrection story and deep into the story of Jesus, everybody's named Mary. There are disciples, and then there's a whole bunch of Marys. There's Mary Magdalene. There's Mary, the mother of Jesus. There's this Mary who is actually Mary, the mother of James, but not James and John. Mary, the mother of the other James. It's very confusing.
Mary, the wife
and
of Clopas.
There's Mary, the wife of Clopas, and there's Mary of Bethany, who's not any of the other Marys. Every time, it seems like whenever I revisit the Marys, there's another Mary I didn't even know about. There's so many Marys, too many Marys. And again, if the eyewitnesses were inventing a story, would they have named all the characters Mary? Would they have sent 3 Marys to the tomb? But yet, we know, if you will look into ancient history in the time of Jerusalem, I've actually done this study, Mary was the most common of women's names. It was not an uncommon name. Just as Simon was the most common of men's names, and there were 2 Simons among the disciples. So, there are 2 Marys in Mark and Matthew's account. After the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. Excuse me. And suddenly there was a great earthquake. You'll remember from last week, if you were with us for that lesson, there was an earthquake during the crucifixion of Jesus. And now another earthquake comes. And it comes at this moment. For an angel of the Lord, descending from heaven, came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes white as snow. For fear of him, the guards shook and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here, for he has been raised, as he said. Come see the place where he lay, then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has been raised from the dead. And indeed, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him." Most of our lesson is going to come out of the words of the angel here. But so at this point, so they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came to him, took hold of his feet, which shows us that it wasn't just a vision, wasn't just a hallucination. They physically took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." You will remember that all of this happens where? In the vicinity of Jerusalem, the big city where none of the disciples are probably very comfortable. Crowded city at Passover. They're told to go back home where they're comfortable, where their fishing nets are, and there they will experience Jesus. Those are the verses. That's the story. Now, here's what I want to ask you. Various Easters, we use various gospel accounts. One year it'll be Matthew's account, one year it'll be Luke's. We use John's perhaps more than any other because John is the one with the intimate encounter with Mary Magdalene where she calls him teacher and he says Mary, and it's just such a moving account, as everything in John always is. But this is the account of Matthew, and if I were to ask you, what are some images you get of the resurrection when you think of that story? And you would realize, as we said, you don't see Jesus emerging from the tomb because it's never mentioned in any of the Gospels. It is something that has already happened. What you do see is the women coming to the tomb. And you do see an angel. And you do see a stone rolled away. And generally, there's a command from the angel, often depicted in one of the Gospels, anyways. So, those are some of the images that you get for the resurrection. That's what we're on a question. How many women went to the tomb? How many went to the tomb? Now,
Go ahead, type your answer in on the
right.
comments.
And I'm noticing, I hope this is just on my Kindle Fire, but my video is breaking up a little bit, so we're hoping that this isn't the case in the video we're making. But anyway, all of this is an experiment. We're making it beforehand, so we'll see. If you said one woman went to the tomb, A, let me give you the four. A, one woman. B, two women. C, three women. D, four or more women. A bunch of women. Then a whole Bible study of women. Then, that would be D. So write down your letter. Now, if you said one woman, that would be correct if you're a lover of the Gospel of John. In John, one woman goes to the tomb, and it was that woman, you could name it, Mary Magdalene. In all four Gospels, Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb. If you said selection B, two women, then you're reading the Gospel we just read, Matthew. You might have just looked at the passage and, well, it's two Marys. Matthew has Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, Mary the mother of the other James, the other Mary, mother of the other James. So, if you said three women went to the tomb, you'd also be correct. Because Mark, the very first gospel written, has two Marys, same two Marys, plus Salome. Now, not the same Salome from the story of John the Baptist. There are actually two in the Gospels. There's one who danced for the king and declared and asked that John the Baptist's head be chopped off. And then there's another Salome who's only mentioned in Mark, she was supposed to have been at the tomb. And this was one of the earliest gospel written. But she goes to the tomb in this story, and then for reasons that we'll talk about in a second, she's not mentioned again. And then if you said four or more, three or four or more, whatever, Luke is the gospel. And we would have guessed it would be Luke. And I'll tell you why. Luke is the gospel writer of the women. Luke gives more attention to the women. He always names the women. Remember, Luke set out to write a gospel, he says in the beginning of his gospel, by interviewing everybody. And interviewing everyone who knew Jesus. And he went and he interviewed the women. They were the most eager to talk, I'm sure. Women lived a little longer. Remember, Jesus' mother Mary lived longer apparently than Joseph did. So the women were still alive, and he interviewed them and he gave them names. So, and some of Jesus's most encounters with women happened in the Gospel of Luke. In Luke, we have the Marys again. We have a Joanna, and it says other women. There are other women. So Luke, there's lots and lots of women visiting the tomb. So he couldn't get enough of them. Now, so you see, you might ask a question, why don't the Gospels have their story straight on this? Why didn't, once Mark wrote it down, why didn't they just take Mark's word for it? Well, the answer seems to be, and this is very often discussed, why, if the Gospels in many cases were aware of each other, as they were, Luke says, many others have set out to write a story of Jesus, so he knew about other Gospels. Matthew and Luke, we know for a fact, both had Mark. They knew what Mark said. They had it right in front of them. And John probably had all three Gospels. So why did they vary on who visited the tomb? And why did they vary, for example, on whether there were one or two angels, etc.? Because they had their own traditions they were writing out of. In all probability, they were vouching for the women they knew about who had visited the tomb. Mark knew for a fact that Salome had visited that tomb. But maybe Matthew and Luke couldn't vouch for that. But they did know about Joanna. And so that they named these people because these people were living eyewitnesses that could testify to going to the tomb. And so there were, remember, the gospel writers, other than possibly John, were not eyewitnesses themselves. For example, Mark was a friend of Peter's who came along later, etc. Matthew, we think that gospel is written out of the tradition of Matthew, but not by the gospel, not by the disciple Matthew. So the gospel writers are writing in the second generation, basically, about 30 years, 20, 30 years later. And by the way, hello, Linus. He is risen. Linus doesn't answer back when I say it. But at any rate, the Gail, where was I? I was saying that
the tradition of the gospel.
The tradition of the gospel writers was to very carefully write about what they could vouch for based on the witnesses they knew about. And the gospels were probably written in different cities, for example, and they had different traditions and different stories. But this is what's important to realize: the basic facts of the resurrection, the main things, the fact that the tomb was empty, the fact that an angel was there, etc. They all agreed on those facts, and there was no disagreement. I'll make one other point about this. If you were making up a story, as people always want to accuse the gospel of doing, if you were making up a story, what would you do? The first rule of making up a story is get your story straight. You and three other guys have robbed a bank. What do? You say, let's get our story straight. Where were we when the bank robbery was supposed to be happening? What were we doing? You get your story straight. You have no reason to vary on little details unless you're perfectly secure that the main things happen. And we get that throughout the Gospels. They vary on the little details, but in no way does that take away from the authenticity of what is being talked about. As a matter of fact, it bolsters it. People who tell the truth will get little things, little details will be off. But in a way, those are the little details being off that make the true part much more reliable, because you can just tell it hasn't been made up. Now, at this point, I'm going to share with you an apocryphal gospel called the Gospel of Peter. The Gospel of Peter was probably written about 150 AD. It's one of a number of apocryphal gospels. Now, Gail asked me, is this part of the Apocrypha in our Bible? No, this is not. This can be confusing. There are books written that, for example, Roman Catholics use between the Old and New Testament. They call things like the Maccabees and some of the other books like that aren't in what we think of as the Bible, but sometimes we include them anyway just for reference because they're interesting. We don't consider them part of God's revealed word, so we don't study them. But those are before the New Testament. There are also apocryphal Christian books, and these were written after what we have in the New Testament. None of them were written at the same time. They were all written afterwards. Now, they seem to exist so that the makers of National Geographic and History Channel TV series can have something to be excited about. So they'll say, the Gospel of Judas, does it really have the real, true Jesus? Even though they know it was written 300 years later and not based on any eyewitnesses, and it's bogus. So the early church had all of these books. They very carefully, over a long period of time, studied all the books, and the books we have in our New Testament were canonized not out of any political reason or anything like that. They were canonized because they were known to be accurate and known to be based on observers, and they were known to have been written by the evangelists who wrote the four Gospels, or Paul, or someone connected to the first generation of Christianity. So this is a bogus gospel. What cracks me up about it is that this supposed gospel of Peter, which could not have been written by anyone connected to Peter because of when it was written. This gospel of Peter, according to scholars, was probably written not by someone who had the other gospels in front of him, a careful scholar like the gospels we have. This was written by someone from memory, from being in church and hearing the gospel stories. So this guy just kind of, it's like if you heard, you went to Sunday school as a kid and you heard the story of Noah, and then you went years later and told the story of Noah to someone without checking the Bible, you'd get a bunch of stuff wrong. That's what this is. This has a whole mishmash of traditions and things in it. And I'm sharing this with you only by way of contrast, so that when you hear what a real bogus gospel story sounds like, you'll realize how authentic the stories we do have are. So this is the way it goes. Let me bring you up to speed because I'm not going to read the entire Gospel of Peter. In Peter's Gospel, Jesus has been buried, and Pontius Pilate has sent a centurion and a bunch of soldiers to guard the tomb.
A bunch of soldiers?
A bunch of soldiers.
And that's how it's written, a bunch of soldiers.
No, I'm not reading. I'm
Oh,
giving
you're
you.
summarizing.
I'm summarizing because
Okay.
I'm not going to read the whole thing.
Okay.
So Pontius Pilate has sent a centurion and a bunch of soldiers to guard the tomb.
Okay.
Then a whole bunch of Jewish elders and scribes follow them out to the tomb. So already we have a centurion, a lot of soldiers, and then kind of a whole coterie of Jewish elders and scribes. We have a bunch of people out of the. This is a little garden tomb, but it's just got a mob out there. And by the way, Pontius Pilate has washed his hands. That little bit, which is so pandemic friendly to us, happens. But it says none of the Jews washed their hands. So already we pick up part of the agenda is to kind of protect Pontius Pilate's reputation at the expense of the Jewish leaders.
Okay.
So there's an anti-Semitic kind of agenda.
Yeah.
This is probably written not in Israel, but somewhere else. So they add that the hand washing doesn't. There's no reason the Jews would wash their hands. I mean, that was a Roman thing they were doing, other than purity reasons. Then everybody rolled the great stone against the door. Again, I'm not reading from the gospel. I'm summarizing. The whole mob rolls the great stone against the door, and they marked it with 7 wax seals. Now I'm thinking maybe they've been listening to some Revelation, in church too, because the 7 wax seals found their way into this gospel. Then they pitched a tent, which had to be a pretty big tent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we've got the scribes and the elders from the Jewish faith, and we've got centurions. Basically everybody but Pontius Pilate. Everyone in town is there. And the disciples, they were not there either. And they all kept watch. And then early in the Sabbath, pretty much everyone else in Jerusalem then shows up. So everyone I haven't mentioned, so I don't know whether the disciples and Pilate came, but everybody's out there at the sign out here to hang out at the tomb. It's just the place to go for some reason. Even though there's been no resurrection or anything, it's just, they're all there. That's where we pick up reading. This is the words of the Gospel of Peter. Then there was a loud voice in heaven, and they saw that the heavens were opened, and 2 males who had much radiance had come down from there and approached the tomb. But that stone which had been thrust against the door, having rolled by itself, went a distance off to the side. So the stone kind of rolls all by itself off to the side. The tomb opened, and both the young men entered it. Now the soldiers saw this and awakened the centurion and the elders, for they too were present safeguarding. And I would add parenthetically, somehow they slept through the large mob and the voice from heaven and all of that happening. And while they were relating what they had seen, again they see 3 males who have come out from the sepulchre, with the 2 supporting the other one. So I guess it's implied the 2 angels come out and they're kind of giving Jesus kind of like the way soldiers carry a wounded soldier. Jesus is apparently not fully resurrected yet, and they're helping him out. And a cross following them. This is maybe my favorite detail. There's a walking cross. And we're going to hear again from this cross. The cross follows them out, and I don't know why there would have been a cross in the tomb in the first place. And the head of the two reaching unto heaven, but that of the one being led out by a hand by them, going beyond the heavens. Now I got to ask you, what would that look like? So the two angels' heads were going up to heaven, and the man they were supporting, his head went beyond the heavens. I guess because he's Jesus. The only sense I can make out of this is the way a child draws the sky. How does a child draw the sky? Blue line at the top of the page, right?
Yeah.
That's how children always draw the sky. So maybe they're envisioning. This is obviously someone that was not an observer. It's just making it up out of his imagination, because there's nowhere in the Bible where it says someone's head's reached heaven and another guy's head went beyond heaven. That's just kind of crazy. So, but that of the one being let out. Okay, they were hearing a voice from the heavens saying, "Have you made proclamation to those who have fallen asleep?" And the cross said, "Yes." So the cross, it walks and talks. This is a walking, talking cross. And the gospel goes on from there. And as a matter of fact, it has another empty tomb story from the next day. I don't, it's crazy. So again, why did I spend so much time telling you that? You don't really need on these to hear from the gospel, Peter. If the gospels we have were fake, they would sound a little bit like that. But they're not. When you read these gospels, you might think, there are things missing from here. There are things I'd like to know. I'd like to have known what it was like at the moment when Jesus emerged from the tomb. It's not told to us. I'd like to know what Mary was thinking the first time she saw, but it doesn't go into her mind. It just tells you what she saw. I'd like to know about the man who, that was standing, that was like an angel and like a man. I'd like to know more about that. It doesn't tell you those things. It tells you exactly what the observers witnessed and experienced. And that has the ring of truth to it, because no one is making any attempt to fabricate walking and talking crosses or heads reaching to heaven or anything like that to impress you a little bit more, as if someone's trying to one up the gospels already written. They're trying to tell you basically what happened, to the point that Mark ends his gospel with the women in awe, going back and initially not even telling anybody. They go back to their homes, and even though they've been told to go tell the disciples, they don't tell anybody at first. And Mark leaves it there because he's told us from the very first verse of his book, this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. When he reaches the end of the beginning, he stops. And that's it. That's the end of the gospel. He knows Jesus rose from the dead. His readers know Jesus rose from the dead. He's writing for followers of Christ. They don't need it proven to them. They just want to know what the eyewitnesses saw and heard. Now, let's go back. I added all of that because I think, again, we want to experience a sense of wonder at Linus. Look at me when I'm teaching. Don't look out at the squirrels. We want to experience a sense of wonder from that the disciples experienced. We want to feel what Mary and the other women, however many of them there were, experienced. We want to fall on our feet and proclaim, "You are the Lord, you are the Son of the living God," as they did, as Thomas did later on. And so we need to know that we can believe. First of all, that we can believe. So I want to focus on what the angel said. I'm looking at the wrong thing. This is what I need to look at. It's the actual real gospel, not the gospel of Peter. So, beginning in verse 5, the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus who is crucified. He is not here, for he has been raised as he said." Now, the first thing angels always say, do not fear, do not be afraid. That's not very obvious because, again, angels are almost never described other than radiance here, brightness, radiance. Angels aren't usually described other than looking like people, but something about them strikes great fear into the observer. So they say, do not be afraid. And then they give a message. They always give a message. And the angels are go-betweens between the natural and the supernatural, between God and people. Angels come and they give a message that people could not get any other way. So the angel comes to kind of certify that Jesus is not here. He has been raised as he said. He kept his promise. Now there's two commands that are given here. The first command is come see the place where he lay. The second command is then go quickly and tell his disciples he has been raised from the dead. So, again, very, very clear. He has been raised from the dead. But the message is number one, come and see. And number two, go and tell. Come and see, go and tell. The come and see is the essential work of Easter. What we need to do is to come to the tomb. Last week we came to the cross. When we come to the cross, we need to feel deep sorrow. We need to feel a deep love for Jesus because of the love he has for us. For a man who laid down his life, not only for his friends, but for his enemies. When we come to the tomb, the next Sunday, to the sepulcher, as Peter calls it, we need to feel what happens when your fear is turned, in your sorrow and your wailing and your mourning is turned to dancing. And one cannot exist without the other. You will never feel true delight in someone's being alive unless you thought they were dead. Have you ever worried that someone that you loved was in an automobile accident, or that, well, I know there's people in our class that have very definitely experienced that. You thought someone was going to die and then they didn't die. Remember the exhilaration you felt when you got the greatest news you ever received? You would never feel that exhilaration if you hadn't felt the sorrow first. The first thing we need to do is we need to feel the sorrow. When the women came to the tomb, and by the way, the women are mentioned at every phase. I think I've said this. At every phase of this story, they're there, skulking in the back at the trial, kind of hiding in the back. They're very definitely right there, front and center at the cross, when everyone else was afraid to be. We've talked about it might be that it was possible for them to do that because women were virtually invisible in that time. They were so looked down upon, so mistreated, so disrespected, discarded, that there were some advantages. They could be invisible. They could go to the cross, they could go to the tomb. The disciples probably had to fear a little more. Isn't that Peter, Jesus' disciple? He was scared half to death, and that's why he denied it. But the women were there at the trial, they were at the crucifixion, they were at the burial, and then they were at the tomb. This is necessary because in every case, the gospel tells us they saw, they saw, they saw, they saw. They saw all these things, and therefore they were able to take it in. And they became our first evangelists. Now, I think we've mentioned this in the past, or you might have heard this mentioned. In the first century, women could not give testimony in court. Women could not give testimony in court because they were women. Only men's testimony counted. It harkens to even 100 years ago, women couldn't vote. They weren't counted as people. So that's not correct. 100 years ago, if the gospel writers were making this story up, the witnesses would not be women. And let me make a very quick point about this too. The first thing written down to give eyewitness testimony to the resurrection is not in the Gospels. It's in 1 Corinthians 15. And you should read it. One of the most important passages in Scripture because it's written perhaps 15 to 20 years after the resurrection.
And before any of the
Gospels, long before the Gospels were written. And Paul was actually talking about it time before that when he visited Jerusalem. Paul is roughly a contemporary of Jesus, but he never met Jesus before the crucifixion and resurrection. But he went after he became a Christian and he visited Peter and John and spent about 3 days with them in Jerusalem. And he tells how, in 1 Corinthians 15, how he met Peter and John and heard everything they had to say about Jesus. And what account does Paul give us of who the eyewitnesses were? He said he appeared first to Peter, I believe, and then he appeared. He mentions Peter and James and all the disciples, and then 500 witnesses, and he doesn't mention the women. He doesn't mention the women, even though we know they were the eyewitnesses. So this, you see, Paul is falling back on the tradition of just kind of not thinking of mentioning the women. I can remember a time when I was told, Rob, when you call on someone to pray after Sunday school class, ask a woman every now and then, or in youth, because there's just such a thing where you just, the guys, we just ask the guys to do certain things, just the guys do. So it's just kind of a, something written in that and that's a whole other lesson for another time. But Paul falls back on what the disciples are doing and the fact that, well, the eyewitnesses were the disciples. The real first eyewitnesses were the women. So what we need to do is we need to enter the tomb as the women did. We need to experience the full meaning and impact of the fact that Jesus has risen from the dead. Because it doesn't just mean something for Jesus, it means something for us. It means death is defeated. And it means even more than death. It means we can have hope for everything. The Easter story is a story about hope. And we have to fully take that message in. And we have to fully get into that story until the story fully gets into us. So that we can fully and completely understand the meaning of the resurrection. The fact that he is risen. He is risen indeed. That should absolutely animate us with excitement and hope, whether there's a coronavirus, whether there are job problems, whether we're worried about friends and family. We'll worry about those things. But the fact that there's an Easter experience should undergird everything we experience in life. Secondly, we need to go and tell. After we go and tell won't have much effect if we haven't come and seen. We have to. Coming and seeing is more than taking in with our eyes. It's more than sitting in a church service. It's more than sitting in a Sunday school lesson. Coming and seeing is meditating. It's reflecting. It's letting the resurrection take hold of our souls so that we begin to feel the full meaning of what it means. And so then, having taken that in, then we will want to go and tell. We naturally go and tell on anything we're excited about. If you heard incredible, exciting news about a new job that you got, or something happened to someone in your family, an honor, a wonderful thing, you couldn't wait to go tell people about it. You would just do it naturally. You wouldn't need a command. It's just what you would do. So, out of the experience of the resurrection comes the joyful experience of telling. It's not something you have to force yourself to do. It's not something you go do on the street corner. It's sharing with the people around you what it means to know the risen Christ. That's what I've got today. I want to close this in prayer, and I want to challenge you in a few minutes as you join the live stream Easter worship service that Doc and the staff lead. I want you to fully experience the glory of Easter. And if you have trouble feeling anything, ask God to help you feel what you should feel. Jesus talked about worshiping in spirit and in truth in John 4. He says we worship in spirit, that's emotions and feelings, and then we worship truth, that's the mind. So as you enter into worship, worship with your mind and your spirit and offer yourself to God. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for Easter. Gosh, what an understatement that is. There are no words of gratitude that could be full enough in expressing what we feel and should feel about the gift you have given us. The fact that we can know we have eternal life, but that we can also know we have the full and abundant life in the here and now. You've done so much for us. The hope of it is so great that it's hard for us to take in that your Son is risen. As we worship today, do help us to worship in spirit and in truth. Help us to know on this coronavirus Easter, when there is